All right, I'm back. After a hiatus, I haven't been in the frame of mind to count. So, this is the Shaggy Dog Philosophy Podcast. I am the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. Still, I suppose, in the middle of a rebrand. This is where an established podcaster or YouTuber or whatever would tell you that what's going on with their life, and I don't know if I'm at that point where I even should, but I will. My hiatus was the result of spending a week in a mental health facility, hospital, whatever, that I'm not going to talk about and don't want to talk about yet. And then the other half of it was putting myself together after the damage they did to me in said institution, and then any other missing time, it was just spent sitting and staring at my hands and wondering why they wouldn't do what I want them to do. But I'm back, baby, is what people would say. And I've actually spent a lot of time evaluating exactly what it is I'm doing here and just how efficacious what I'm doing here is. If what I'm doing is talking to myself, and I'm doing this for me, and you're meant to put the pieces of what I'm saying together on your own in the same way that I learn, I have no efficacy for other people. And obviously the efficacy for me was extremely limited. So I've been thinking, I've been applying my pattern recognition skills to the lecturers and the educators that I have observed, whether I've enjoyed them or I've not enjoyed them. And what I notice is that if you want to talk about a topic, you have to talk at the simplest level up. And so you have to build your abstractions to what you're talking about. And my hesitation to do that, I suppose, is that in a 2-hour format, you have a very limited amount of time in which to grab your audience's attention. And on YouTube, especially, long videos like mine rarely reward the audience's attention. They rarely reward us for watching. So like History Hit and Curiosity Network, and channels like them rarely are even about what they say they're about. Whether that be because they were structured for television or because they were tagged and titled and thumbnailed misleadingly is completely irrelevant to my point. So what I have to do is I have to establish over time that I'm a trustworthy source of information. Which means that really I need to cite myself, I need to source what I'm saying so that you don't have to spend 30 years researching and learning about and piecing together these things on your own. So, that being said, I was thinking, how can I talk about what I want to talk about? And what I want to talk about is how the humanities are a house divided in Western scholarship, and in the context of humanities being a house divided, I think I've figured out that, in fact, it is comparative mythology's fault. And now what fault exactly means when you're talking in the context of scholastic habits is an interesting thing to say and try to get into. And so what I don't want to talk about is that, because that's too big a thing, and there are too many words I'm going to need to define, and that's also something I'm going to do, is I am going to spend more time defining my words, because I made the mistake of reading a book trying to extol the virtues of determinism, which is too big a word for us to talk about, in the same way that choosing to do an only 2-hour podcast on relativism, while I still wasn't sure of what relativism really even is, was overreaching. So we're not going to talk about that. what I want to talk about specifically is how mythology has been interpreted in bad faith over the course of the last 200 years, maybe even 300 years. And then definitely it's been misinterpreted in bad faith over the course of the last 1,000 years. Okay. And so before I can get into that, and before I can do the interpretation that I actually want to do for you, I'm going to reinterpret the Medusa story for you, the Medusa character for you. And I'm going to explain what that icon means and what that symbol means and what that character means and who she was and what she's doing in the narrative of the story. And what I don't want to do is read source texts, and I don't want to read other people's commentaries. Now, if we get into this and I'm like an hour in and I want to get to 2 hours and I feel like I'm not quite getting where I want to be, I will do an Astonishing Legends type dive, but I don't want this channel to become Astonishing Legends, because in the same way that I'm neither Rhett nor Link from YouTube, I'm neither of those guys either. And in a lot of ways, the same rejection that I feel from other of my intellectual heroes, or people that I thought were my intellectual peers at least, is sourced there. So I shouldn't even have brought them up, because, you're not supposed to do that shit. You're supposed to talk about other creative people and how they were good to you. Not spill Mountain Dew all over yourself like a fucking idiot. Right, karma, man. It strikes me instantaneously. So, let's talk about what bad faith means. And in order to talk about what bad faith is, we have to talk about what the word faith means. And the word faith in the English language today is a word with very little meaning. So I actually am going to do an etymological dive, not from memory. Let's go search it, right, from Etym Online. Probably my favorite website. I always want to tell people that dictionary.com is my favorite website, but it might be Etym Online, any etymology site. But the first result you'll get if you type in faith etymology, man, cats, I swear to God. I am seriously surrounded by cats. We no longer have 5. My Vader left us shortly after my return from the hospital. And my girlfriend is a cat. So, where was I? So you do search faith etymology, and what Google will provide you is from Oxford Languages, and what it gives you is a little flowchart. From Latin, faith comes from fides, which means the field, actually. It's a field. Leave the door cracked so the cat can come in if he wants to visit, and then close it so that he can leave if he wants to leave. And he comes in and then pushes the door closed so he can't leave. I pop it open so he can come out. He can go out, and then he immediately comes back in. No. We're not, no. Anyway, I'm saying the wrong word because I can't read. That word is feed. F-E-I-D. Feed. And it became faith. It became faith in Middle English because because Middle English was impacted by the Viking languages, and the Viking languages, that hard D sound, D, becomes the. So, yeah, here it is. Okay, so from Etym Online, I'm really starting off with a bang, and that's fine. It's going to take me some time. My brain, I don't know if I discussed this in my grief episode, but my brain, because of the grief from losing my Vader and the shattering of my self-image in the hospital, has left me unable to think and plan and it's left my brain unable to function at the level that I'm used to. So everyone keeps telling me to do what I can do. So from Middle English of the 13th century, so the 1200s, faith, fey, or fi were faithfulness to a trust or promise, loyalty to a person, honesty, truthfulness. From Anglo-French and Old French, feed, foi, faith, or probably feed, foi, faith, belief, trust, confidence, a pledge from the 11th century, so the 1000s, from Latin fides, which means trust, faith, confidence, reliance, credence, belief. Credence is adherence to your creed, and your creed is your religion, and your religion is your binding to a faith way, a faith path. See how it circles back around on itself? From the root of fidere, which is to trust. From PIE, which is the Proto-Indo-European root, bathe, to trust, confide, persuade. For sense evolution, compare belief. It has been accommodated to other English abstract nouns in the th, truth, and health. Okay, and so a more modern use of the word is from the early 14th century, so the 1300s, assent of the mind to the truth of a statement for which there is incomplete evidence, especially belief in religious matters. So faith, I like this definition. Faith is an assent of the mind to the truth of a statement for which there is incomplete evidence. I really like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, because, see, I should be smart. I'm going to include you guys in my creative process so you can tell me where I'm going wrong, because that's something else I think I need to talk about. And that's whether a prophet or a person of my kin can ever be wrong, and what to do when a person who wants to say they're a prophet or a leader is wrong and is objectively wrong. I've been listening to Center Place more, and John recently did a video about a lecture about the prophetic monarchy of Mormonism, and it's left me thinking whether prophets can be wrong, and whether God's message changes, or whether God's message does in fact remain the same. We just have grown, we have matured into a more adult or a more adolescent, really, relationship with the Father. And John didn't propose that. I watched another, I'm going to do this. My brain is going to do this. I got trapped trying to find an answer to righteous warfare, because I'm very stressed out about the Israel thing, the Israel-Palestine thing. I have spoken a lot about Jewish hypocrisy leading up to that conflict, and I don't feel responsible for either side, but I do, and so I'm going to have to talk about that. But I only found one person who was willing to talk about righteous warfare, righteous conflict, and I had to find it by searching for righteous conquest. And it was a preacher from this very year talking about the book of Joshua, and that's not what we're talking about. But it is in a lot of ways, because what that sermon is in fact what it was. What that man was trying to articulate is that God's message has remained consistent, whether it be in the Jewish Testament or the Christian Testament, and that we have, as we have evolved as a species, we have interpreted it in, as I would say, for the purposes of our continuing to discuss bad faith, I would say we have interpreted it in increasingly better faith. Okay, so if faith is an assent of the mind to the truth of a statement for which there is incomplete evidence, okay, that a faithful interpretation of any work of symbolism even doesn't even need to be symbolism. Any faithful or good faith interpretation of a work takes the work, does what in English we say, gives the work the benefit of the doubt. And now, the benefit of the doubt is a term that I don't want to define. I know that it is a colloquial idiom, but basically it takes it on its own merit. So, a good faith interpretation in the terms that we've already defined and used on this podcast, or at least in the space of this podcast, is respect. And respect is appreciating or valuing or at least evaluating a thing in its context. And so a good faith interpretation of a work is respectful of the work as well as of the author of the work and the audience of the work. We forget frequently to remember who the audience is. So I'm going to do this. One of the things that I find soothing when my brain is like this is monster fiction. Especially monster folklore. I love monster folklore because very infrequently do people actually get hurt in monster folklore. They encounter a thing, and very infrequently do they actually get hurt. And I don't like violence. And I prefer a supernatural world that can't harm us in a direct way. And so I and my girlfriend were talking, and I used the term witch to mean... I use the word witch in the meaning that they use in the Bell Witch story. And so we're not going to get into all of that, but we watched the Bell Witch story, and what I'm trying to talk about as far as I'm trying to talk about bad faith interpretation and what bad faith interpretation looks like, and then I'm going to define it. So we kind of defined good faith, taking it in its context and being respectful of the people and evaluating them properly and putting them in their proper context and including them in the story correctly and with respect, with dignity. And now dignity is a word we're not going to define because dignity is another old word, but it's related to Dane. So anyway, in the Bell Witch story, we listened to two different versions of it because I didn't want to listen to the Astonishing Legends 6-hour version of it. And the first one that we watched was from the History Hit Network, and it was basically a Tennessee Tourism Board commercial. And good on them. That's the only way that they could make that particular kind of documentary. And the other was a 2-hour podcast or more, similar to my format, similar to Astonishing Legends format, by a Brit who was extremely racist toward Americans, extremely condescending, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. He was very, very condescending and hateful, said very, very unkind things. And again, unkind and hateful are words that I really need to define, but we're going to continue on hoping that you know what those words mean about Americans, but specifically about the Tennessee farmers that were dealing with this witch. And now a witch, in their context, is a disincorporated or disembodied intelligent entity, and we're not going to get into all of what's going on with that because I don't want to talk about that. I do, but I don't. I could do hours and hours and hours and hours and hours on the Bell Witch if you wanted to tune in to listen to me talk about monster folklore and interpret what's going on with monster folklore, and I would love that because I can, and I see. The people that I want to be my peers see me as a competitor, and I see them as a peer. And in fact, I see them as someone that I want to work for free, and that makes everyone uncomfortable. Okay, so what happened was, at the end, he referenced Joe Nichols and I can't remember the other guy's name, Skeptoid. Known terrible people and known bad thinkers who rely on the clout and the celebrity of the amazing Randy or whatever his damn name is. And so both of them are going to be irrelevant inside this decade. They may even already be irrelevant because the scientific skeptical community has broken apart as a house divided in the same way that the humanities did, and for the same reason, for assuming that the women were only there to get pregnant. So they made the claim that the language that's put in the mouths of, and the claim that these Tennessee farmers would talk about or even want to write a book about what happened to them because, oh, they're just Tennessee farmers, I'm not arguing specifically that, is actually disrespectful of those people. It shows a gross ignorance of what it was actually like to be a farmer in the 1900s. Those people, especially in the South, were, if not educated in the sense that you think of what an education is, so sitting around and reading scientific tomes, they were literate, and they were literate at an extremely high degree. And so if you think that these people who, in fact, did have a future president stay a week in their home weren't a little bit highfalutin in their language is disrespectful. And so being disrespectful when you interpret a story and then when you retell it, and then when you try to break it apart and allegorize it and understand it, right? If you're disrespectful of anyone at any step of the process, especially if what you're trying to do is be a shaman and clear a village of a monster, or what the scientific skeptics like Joe Nichols and this other guy actually think of themselves as is knights errant, slaying dragons, if you want to be that thing, you have to understand the context of the people that you're helping. And so if you just assume that these people were too ignorant to have written or understood what was going on, they were too ignorant to have fed this monster to adulthood, you can't help them, you can't understand them. And that's bad faith. And so what I'm saying is, they're assenting to the truth of the statement that there was a monster. Okay, if not a monster, because let's talk about what a monster is, what the word monster means. Anything with mon in it has to do with your mind. And so in the PIE languages, the Proto-Indo-European languages, so a monster is a being, a thing, a stir, a whatever, that lives or exists maybe primarily, maybe only or maybe primarily in the mind. Okay? And so when these people are complaining about a monster, and witch is another term for monster or demon or spirit or whatever, ghost, whatever, these words, they all got blended together because of the pigeoning of the English language, because of the various conquests of the British Islands. If you're trying to interpret this monster, you have to begin with an assent of the mind to the truth that something happened. Something happened to these people. And when you're taking their statements and you're taking their account into account, right, you have to know that there is incomplete evidence to prove what happened or disprove what happened. So bad faith is assenting that something happened, but working to disprove it. Okay. And so let's talk a little bit about science and what the scientific process, or at least what the scientific method is. Because any physicist or any modern human being who wants to tell you that science, the word, and the method are divorced from the faith process of being Christian is interpreting the history of the scientific method and the scientific institution in bad faith. What I would normally say is they're lying, but a lie is a broad word. And so when you call someone a liar, they react like, I'm not deliberately and maliciously saying a mistruth. Even when they are deliberately and maliciously misusing the truth. Okay. So I said I was going to define a word. And then I did. I don't want to go back to it. So I want to push on to my next point, because I want to talk a little bit about Medusa. And I don't know if I should front load. No, I should begin with Medusa, right? I don't want to front load the interpretations of the story before I just tell the story. So the Medusa story is largely, like, the specifics and specific stories are largely irrelevant. We can go if I feel like it at the end. We've talked about that. But basically, Medusa was a woman with snakes for hair whose gaze could turn a man to stone. And she has sisters, and she's of the species or the race Gorgon. And now they wouldn't have thought in terms of species because these stories are much older than Aristotle. But they would have thought in terms of race. And race is something that I keep running into with college-educated people. So let's talk about what race is, because what I'm going to do. I heard a joke. Let's start with a funny, right? I heard a guy say that you can't argue the difference in pedophilia and the other two. I don't remember what they are, because if you try to qualify that a person who likes prepubescent people isn't a pedophile, you sound like a pedophile, right? So by trying to argue the specifics of what is and what is not racism, and trying to articulate what is race and the definition of race and the difference in racism and ethnicism, so your race and your ethnicity just makes you sound like a racist. It makes you sound like you're trying to create a bubble for yourself, in the same way that I sound like I'm trying to create a bubble for myself to be anti-Semitic. And I'm aware of that. So it's a bubble that I'm trying not to create for myself. But your race is your family tree. It's your lineage. It's your heritage in a kind of way. So race is complicated, because race is an abstraction that was never meant to be blown up into the nationalistic or even the state scale. Your race is kind of your village. Like I was kind of doing the math in my head the other day, and I've lived in a major city, Columbus, and I've lived in a minor city, Asheville, and I've lived in, as an adult, I've lived in small towns. I've lived in a village, Piketon, Ohio, and small towns in Waverly and Zanesville. And there seems to be something that's true, and no matter what century or even half century you live in. And that's that you can only really know well about 7 people. And so that gets me back to, I wanted to define science and the scientific method, right? And so science is the Greek word that means knowing, and the method for what you can know is is there's a method for testing it, right? And the first step is to have a hypothesis, and the one rule of doing the scientific method is that you're not supposed to interpret or even try to prove your hypothesis. You're supposed to be working to disprove your hypothesis. And so when I say that I'm all fucked up right now, but when I say that that myth and mythology, and especially comparative mythology, are in bad faith interpreting myth, what I mean is that they are coming at the myth with a preconceived idea, and then they're working backward to prove their idea, rather than allowing the myth or the data, the images, the data with the information within the myth to speak for itself. And so now I'm all confused on where I was before I remembered what I was talking about suddenly. But we're just going to keep pushing through that. This is the brokenness of my brain. Medusa was of the race Gorgon, and she had 3 sisters. Okay, and so I was saying that no matter where you live, you can only know well about 7 people, which means that you only have, most people, probably you, definitely probably me, only have the cognitive capacity to allow 7 people's behavior to speak for themselves. The rest of us are working on assumptions and archetype. Okay? And so when you talk about race, especially when you talk about fantasy or mythological, fantastical or mythological races, what you have to bear in mind is that we're talking about archetype. Okay? So we're talking about an archetype. We're not talking about an actual village of people who existed. And so when they're talking about things like centaurs or people in the Way Out that are half horse, half man, they're not talking about real half horse, half man people. They're talking about the Proto-Indo-European steppe peoples. They're talking about the future Huns, the future Mongolians, the future Magyars. They're talking about the Turkomans and those people, who are people that they would have interacted with, because something that I think most people, even modern Greek people, forget to remember is that Athens is not the only place that claimed to be of the Greek race. Okay? There were racially Greek people all over Anatolia, and Anatolia is one of the ancestral homelands of these people that I'm describing, the steppe peoples. Anatolia is where the Hittites used to live, and the Hittites were descendants of PIE, Proto-Indo-European peoples. A lot of the reason that the Hittite Empire collapsed with the Bronze Age collapse circa 1177 BC, the book 1177 BC, the year the world ended, I believe is the subtitle, is incredible, and I highly recommend it. Fantastic historian and author. Great speaker, too, if you just want to listen to a guy talk about a book that he wrote. But a lot of the reason that the Hittites, who, if you're familiar with the Bible or you're familiar with Egyptian Egyptology, Egyptian history, you're aware are the people in Anatolia who ruled Anatolia and who were rivals to the ancient Jewish state, and definitely were in fact rivals of the ancient Egyptian state. And a lot of the reason they collapsed is what we today call the Sea Peoples, and we act like, well, we don't know who the Sea Peoples were. Well, we don't know who the Sea Peoples were by that definition, because the Sea Peoples is a name, is a negative, racially motivated epithet for a whole slew of people who weren't Egyptian. But what they were was racially Greek, all right? And they, in their way, because of various disasters in their own homelands, conquered and scattered the Hittite nation. And then those people were still Greek racially. So they still thought of themselves as descendants of the same people that the Athenians and the Spartans and the Macedonians, maybe pronounced Macedonians, but I don't think so, because they don't have that sound, and they wouldn't spell it with a C anyway, if they did. Not at that time anyway. Those people were all one race. They could all trace their ancestors back to a common village of people, and they did. That's what the Iliad and the Odyssey and stories like Medusa came from. Is they came from that cultural interchange over the course of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years. No, not 2,000 years. Maybe 2,000 years if you stretch it 1,000 years into the past when Mycenae ruled the Mediterranean. And ruled is an interesting word that I don't want to get into, but it really means measured. It doesn't mean reigned over. Because at that time, when the word was used, a pharaoh, for instance, or a king of kings, for example, couldn't actually reign over distant peoples. The only people they could reign over were the people in their immediate vicinity. The way they could say that they ruled over the whole world was that they had measured it, and that people in the distantest parts that they had measured respected the King of Kings as such, whether they were equally King of Kings or they were the furthest the king could reach of people who would pay tribute to him and also acknowledge his rulership, or at least his reign over a distant, powerful people. And that's what superiority means. You know, when you recognize another king's superiority, which is something that Charlemagne ran into with the Greek Holy Roman Empire, or the Greek Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Excuse me. Was being acknowledged as superior in the land from which they came to the king of the foreign land. So what Charlemagne ran into was that the emperor in Byzantium believed that he, in fact, ruled and reigned over modern France, and Charlemagne says, well, no, I'm superior in my lands to you and my lands. And so that's a conflict that happens all the time in history. Still happens. So Medusa is an archetype that's old. A woman with snakes, especially a woman with snakes in the hair, is a reference to very old religion. Very, very old. We don't have, or at least I've never seen references to it in art, statuary, wall paintings, etc. If they exist, other than where I'm about to say, I'm unaware of it, and I would love it if somebody knew of more from the Axial Age, or at least before the Bronze Age collapse. So I've never seen Stone Age statuary of this, or earlier, but the Mycenaean people, or the Minoan people, as they're also called, they had charming, snake dancing high priestesses. And I have no reason to doubt that they would let the snakes coil up in their hair. And in fact, I have no reason to doubt that they wouldn't dress their hair up in specific ways to allow the snake's perches in there, with headdresses, etc., to look like, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if they wore decorative, like gold or whatever. And a lot of the reason we won't have any of these artifacts would be like, if you found a cache of gold serpent headdresses because these people abandoned everything, like in Central and South America, you melt that shit down instantly. That shit melted, jewels, all of it sold, gone, all of it, because that's not your culture. And even if you repurpose it for your means, gold is too valuable a material to allow to sit around in a modern style museum to ancient people. Now, we have so much gold and we have so many other things that are rare and valuable that other people's gold is novel and interesting and should be collected and should be protected and should be observed and respected. And again, I really am talking to you, Israel, with your fucking black market for antiquities. And so I have no reason to doubt that Medusa and the Gorgons aren't Mycenaean. And a lot of the reason I have no reason to doubt that the Gorgons aren't Mycenaean is because so much of the really, truly ancient, like the Homeric Greek mythology, is cultural warfare against Mycenae. So the story about the Minotaur and the hero that goes into the labyrinth and slays the Minotaur and liberates the Athenian people from the tyranny or whatever of the Minotaur and of King Midas. That whole story is cultural warfare of a people that are subjugated to a superior military. So they have similar racial backgrounds, but like the Spartans with the Mycenae who remained, they were a slave people. The Athenians were a slave people to the Mycenaeans, and Plato tries to remember this and tries to remind the Athenians of this when he tells the Atlantis story. He tries to remind them that Athens was the scrappy, righteous rebellion, and the Atlantean people, because he doesn't name the Minoan people, because people, whether they were, and they may have even called themselves Atlantean, we don't know, but he doesn't put them in Crete where Mycenae was. He puts the Atlanteans in the Atlantic Ocean, in fact, which would make sense why they're called what they're called. So that story is about cultural warfare, about being subjected to the Mycenaean people. And so I have no reason to doubt that, because of the way hero fiction, hero literature, hero mythology works in the PIE tradition, because in the PIE languages, they all have the same story traditions. They don't all have the same myths and the same cycles. And so comparative mythology, if you're interested already, comparative mythology is obsessed with the similarities between the stories, and the stories that stand out as different are the stories that they don't tell. Which is interesting, because linguists are the opposite. Narratologists and mythographers are the opposite of linguists. And it's interesting to me that would be the case, because linguists, when they find a language that's dramatically different from the other languages in the world, but especially in its ethnicity and its location, that's the one they want to talk about. That's the one they want to study, and that's the one they want to learn, and that's the one, obviously, they want to preserve, right? So, like, Sumerian is nothing like Akkadian. Akkadian is a PIE language. It might actually be a Semitic language, but Sumerian is neither PIE nor Semitic, nor Arabic, but I think Arabic might be a Semitic language. So that's interesting. It's right in between those two peoples, but its language is entirely distinct. And its language was, Sumeria's language was eventually wiped out. It eventually became extinct, even in the land of people who called themselves racially Sumerian, because of Akkadian conquests, in the same way that the Welsh and Cornish languages are in fact the older languages on the British Isles, but English is the language that's spoken because of conquest. I have come up with a new mantra, a new phrase that I say after every new thing that I learn. Whether you have or have not, there's this colloquialism, there's this phrase, turtles all the way down. And now I don't want to get into it because that determinism book got into it, and where it comes from is annoying and condescending, and I'm not using it to be annoying and condescending. The turtles all the way down really means that at every level of abstraction, the answer is equally ridiculous and you won't believe it anyway. Which is, if you know the story, what that woman was trying to explain to that scientist. But what I have been saying is that history is racism and politics all the way down. At every abstract level of history, what you find, if you open your eyes and look at it honestly from the perspective of the people writing the history, and the perspective of the audience, and the perspective of the people that they're writing their polemics and their laws against, it's just racism and politics all the way down. And it's not depressing, because what you find is even BLM is racism and politics at every level of abstraction. You know, black people are extremely racist toward black people. I don't know if you live in the United States, but I lived in a majority black community in the United States when the refugees from Nigeria and Syria were brought into the United States circa 2018, 2019. And you should have heard the things that black people called them. They used the hard R, called them horrible words, horrible things, thieves, liars, just the worst kind of things. But they were the same things that city-born people said about recently freed slaves. And so the reason racism exists in this country isn't because of country people, and it isn't because of hateful-hearted white people, old white people. It's because of cities. Cities encourage racism. You can't have a racially liberated community environment when you have sections of your city called Little China and Little Italy, Little Ireland, right? When you have racial pockets of community in your city, well, that divides everyone in the city. So you're not an actual melting pot. You're less a hot pot than you are a bento box. And bento boxes are delicious. So there's no reason to say that New York or San Francisco or even LA are not wonderful places to visit or even live because they're racially segregated. But racial segregation can't be done in a country. Can't be done in a town of 200 people. I mean, it was, but it can't be. You understand? It's not sustainable. And it wasn't sustainable. It didn't make sense for the one black guy in town to have his own bathroom that the establishment had to pay to clean, because that guy wasn't going to use it enough to pay to purchase in your store, and you were going to discourage him from making purchases in your store anyway. So it was an unsustainable business model that was instituted by Southern Democrats, by the way. Anyway, I'm not talking about what I want to talk about. I'm talking about Medusa. And I'm talking about race. I'm talking about the Gorgon race. And the Gorgon race were women with snakes for hair. But Medusa was special because Medusa could turn you to stone with a glance. And we're going to interpret that detail in a moment. We haven't gotten to her death. And her death is important. Because her death is what mythographers, or people at least who write in the mythological space, very frequently neo-pagans, it's what they focus on. And it's where the bad faith lies. And so if you're familiar with the Clash of the Titans, you're familiar with the story. Basically, our hero has to use a shield with a mirror on the other side. Hide behind the mirror. When she looks at herself, she turns herself to stone. And then he's able to cut her head off. And he's able to use her living head, her living gaze, to turn some titan to stone, or something to that effect. But as she exists in the literature that has made its way to us, she is what I call an FSR character, for story reasons character. All of her details, everything about her, because there's so little that we know about her, means that she's an archetype, which means that she's a character who has existed for a long time, and whose details and I don't know that there's another word, whose details are assumed. Her history, her biography is assumed by the audience. They already know it, and what makes that character unique or different is what the author does differently with her from an interpretive standpoint. But we know that authors weren't doing things differently with Medusa. Medusa had become, in a way, canonized. And canon is a word that I need to define and I need to get into, and we can really talk about canon from multiple abstract levels in another podcast. But quickly, for our purposes, the word canon is the Greek word for ruler, and so a canon of a body of work is the work that you, as a new author or an author entering the storytelling marketplace, have to measure up to. So you either have to tell that story as it was told according to the canon, or you have to do something so interesting with it that people forget the canon, or add you to the canon. You raise the bar, or you add another notch, as it were, to the ruling stick, the measuring stick. Or you, in fact, create an entirely different tool by which to measure the universe and for humans to measure themselves, which is what science and the scientific method were, and those are fundamentally Christian processes. So that's why Eastern people, Chinese, Indians, that's why they can't do science. That's why they do it so badly. That's in fact why the Muslims are so bad at rhetoric. It's really annoying how bad they are. But we have spent 2,000 years honing those skills to if you're familiar with his Dark Materials, honing those skills to a razor's edge that's one atom narrow. That's monotheism, and that's finding what the true God is, right? Is that one atom narrow blade. And Islam has only started trying to do it in the last 100 years, since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They didn't think they needed those skills. They thought that the white people had those skills, right? So they did what I'm saying. Civilizations collapse when you segregate skill sets by race. And you say, okay, well, this race is the rhetoricians, and the rhetoricians are white Christians in a brown Muslim population, right? That becomes a problem. That becomes a very real problem, and it becomes a cancer that will destroy your civilization. And so, in a lot of ways, that's why I warn very strongly against people just turning a blind eye to the fact that the black population of the United States is encouraging black populations around the world to invent a racial history for themselves. And not just a racial history, but to invent civilization over again within their civilizations. A question that's not relevant to our purposes, but which I stumbled on recently is there a difference in invention and discovery, and does anyone ever actually find anything for the first time? Does anyone ever actually make anything for the first time? And is there a fundamental difference between providing the environment for invention, i.e. being a patron or being an employer, and doing the invention? So is there a difference in, is it J.G. Wentworth? That doesn't sound right. It's like Waterhouse or something like that. The banker who bankrolled. Is there a difference in the banker who bankrolled and really robbed Nikola Tesla and Nikola Tesla? And is there really a difference between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison? Is there a difference at the level of the single atom? When you split that hair, right? You split that particle into its composite atoms. Is there a difference between them, right? And the difference becomes one of atomic weights, right? And we know that the difference between the elements is their weight, right? The number of what, protons and neutrons, and isn't it even just the number of electrons that make up their cloud, right? It's the amount of information that it requires to rebuild that element, right? So that means that the difference between Nikola Tesla and J.G. Wentworth, because I'm just going to go with that because it makes me laugh. I like saying the wrong name for my own amusement, especially when I know I'm wrong, because I know that people get annoyed by it. The difference between J.G. Wentworth and Nikola Tesla is one of atomic weights. It's one of the amount of information it requires to accurately rebuild or accurately respect those characters, and the amount of energy that's gone into recreating the banker in our popular imagination has been significantly less, and the amount of and the faith with which we have recreated Thomas Edison in our modern mythology has not been good. Not the amount of faith, but the kind of faith that we have used in recreating him has not been good. You know, we treat him as a fundamental evil and someone not to be like, but whether he did or did not, in fact, intellectually rob Nikola Tesla is irrelevant, because he created and provided the environment for Nikola Tesla to invent things like the light bulb or whatever. So it's an amount, it's what it really breaks down to is Nikola Tesla is the more sympathetic, but he's also the simpler character, because Nikola Tesla was a simple man. He wasn't a complex person with a complex psychology. He was an easy person to recreate. And Thomas Edison and J.G. Wentworth and the banker, probably H.G. Wells. No, that can't be right. Wells Fargo. It was probably Wells Fargo that banked Tesla, and not Tesla, but these names are becoming all the same to me. Edison. They're complex. They're complex because their electron cloud includes other complex people, because J.G. Wentworth, like the banker J.G. Wentworth, isn't himself an individual element, right? So like if, let's say for our purposes, Nikola Tesla is helium or hydrogen. Helium's probably more accurate because helium burns hotter. If Nikola Tesla is helium, then J.G. Wentworth is something more like potassium carbonate, just to grab the first the first complex molecule I could think of, right? Because J.G. Wentworth isn't making his decisions for J.G. Wentworth. Like, Tesla is making his decisions for Tesla. He's making his decisions for Tesla's curiosity. But J.G. Wentworth has an uncountable number of people who rely on him and whom he is also robbing. So his story is more complex. You can't just do a snapshot of his life like you can, do an hour-and-a-half little biography of Nikola Tesla. Not and respect the man and his context and his audience and the people who knew him, who were also involved in making him who he is. So that's why these stories rely on archetype, because there were women who had snakes in their hair. There were women of the race of Gorgo, right? And now, who Gorgo is unimportant. Whether she was the leader of the Scythians, or whether she was some high priest, or whether Gorgo is the name of the high priest position is irrelevant, in the same way that, the word Peto means temptation, but Peto is also the goddess of temptation and a handmaiden of Aphrodite. And the two words are indistinguishable, whether they be the noun or the verb or the goddess, the abstraction. They're used in exactly the same context. So there were Gorgons at some point. That's just a fact. And so what I want to talk about is how, especially feminism and the humanities, are a house divided, and it's difficult to talk about this succinctly, but basically the humanities, because the 1950s were so dismissive of women, are making up for lost time by allowing women to destroy the humanities. And spiteful rage. And so when they read and want to interpret the story of Medusa, who is a viper and needs to die because of her destructive rage. Now, feminism, in all of its waves, doesn't like to interpret pre-Christian mythology as sexual because, for whatever reason, they want to be divorced from the reproductive act entirely. And so that does leave a woman able only to masturbate. So they look at these serpent women and they say, okay, well, there's probably some sexual element there, but there's this whole, let's call it genetic trauma, or at least a genetic memory of the trauma of the 1st century AD, when the term cult prostitute became popular. So we're not going to talk about what that means. That's not for this episode. It is, but it isn't. Because Medusa isn't a cult prostitute. Medusa is a courtesan. She's a woman who hangs out at parties and seduces powerful politicians to get things that she wants done in the democracy of Greece. So they don't want to, and there would be a genetic memory in women of when the only way they were allowed to participate in politics was between the legs of a fat man. I get it. actually. So, because I'm not a woman and because I'm not traumatized and I don't have any interest in denying the story and denying the particular truths of the story, that the most dangerous thing in the world is a beautiful woman. And what's more dangerous than a woman with venomous vipers in her hair? I would argue that there is, in fact, nothing more beautiful, because if you know a man, if you know any man, he's gonna look, and he's gonna think, I cannot look at her eyes, I can just look at her body, and she won't turn me to stone. I can even kiss her, I could maybe even mount her without looking her in the eye. And that's why her eyes turn you to stone, is because that means two things. Of course, it means it makes you erect, because it only affects men. Right? Turns you to stone. I mean, you're going to act like that's not been a euphemism since we invented euphemism? Give me a break. But also, it means that she will harden your heart. She will turn your heart to stone, because if you're a good young man and she manipulates you into doing something against your interests, let's say, the word that they would have used is evil. Let's say she gets you to kill a rival who was actually innocent in her claimed abuses. I've had ex-girlfriends who claim that I put my hands on them in ways I never did, and I've known men who were stupid enough to want to fight me over it. Well, that, if you survive that, and you're not likely to, if you survive that, it will turn your heart to stone. It's a meme now among the prostitutes on the internet who feed off of giving poor, and by poor I don't mean financially insolvent, but emotionally lonesome boys positive reinforcement and encouragement to say things like, all the good men have had their heart broken by bad women. And that's what Medusa is. Medusa is a very powerful but very manipulative woman. Very beautiful, especially very, very beautiful. And so what feminism doesn't want to do is interpret this story as a beautiful woman who's using her beauty and in fact has pathos because men want to use her body. They don't want to interpret her that way because that's who they are. They can't be in their positions to write without being that woman, without having broken a man's heart, or without having been not looked in the eye while a man mounted her. I mean, come on. Like, let's be honest with ourselves. How many people do we let mount us, or do we mount that we can look in the eye afterward, or during, that we're willing to look in the eye during? And that's what the story is. That's how Jason or whoever defeats her, is by showing her her mirror. Well, we know what mirrors mean in Greek mythology. Narcissus is a story that exists before bronze hand mirrors were available. We know that the reflection is the true self, that they believed that the being inside that reflective surface was the true self. Because what they believed is that, well, what they believed is the truth. They believed the observable truth. And so maybe what I need to do at this point is I need to splash some Schrodinger's cat up on the screen, but recently, as in the last 2 or 3 years, we proved Schrodinger's cat. They were able to get a beam of light to do things that it shouldn't do. They were able to get an electron to do things that it's not supposed to do. And so they were able to prove by observing in a double-blinded experiment that electrons exist in a superposition. They exist in a 0-1 everywhere, and where they are observed state. So electrons exist as potential until they're observed. And we proved that. And the Greeks knew that. And so if we're going to act when we talk about the Greek worldview and Greek mythology, like they didn't know that, they didn't call it Schrodinger's cat, they didn't call it superposition, right? But they knew that the universe only existed because it was being observed, okay? That's what the Watchers of Enoch are, and that's what the one God becomes. That's what the angels become, is these watching forces, okay? And they also understood that we, by observing the world, do make the world. And because of that, they were able to communicate with the world, because they were able to interpret what the world was doing in good faith. Okay? Because you can't know that you saw a white squirrel today in an area where you personally have never seen a white squirrel, and you've never heard of anyone having seen a white squirrel. You can't know that that was Demeter or Diana or Ratatoskr or whatever. You can't know that was Apollo or Jesus or your dead aunt. You can't know that. But because you lack the necessary information. But you can trust that it was, and you can act accordingly to it having been. And that's what faith is. So, by removing Medusa from her context, not just her mythological context, but her archetypical context as almost peto, almost like temptation, the temptation to treat women poorly, wrapped up in a Mycenaean snake charming priestess's clothing, that's kind of the same place that Black Widow occupies in Marvel. The beautiful woman who takes advantage of men's weakness because they're not willing to look her in the eye. And if you know anything about fighting, or if you know anything about sports, you know that the eyes never lie. If you know anything about psychology, or you know anything about profiling, you know that the eyes never lie. They used to say, it's an idiom or a colloquialism to say that the eyes are the windows to the soul, but they are, if you understand that the soul is what's reflected in the mirror. And my point is that your eyes don't lie to you either. So when you look in the mirror, you see someone, if you see someone who's trying to lie to you, you see the liar. You see the lie. You see the liar, right? And so the lie and the liar, seeing the mirror, showing Medusa her reflection, is in a lot of ways showing Medusa what she's become because of her choices. And she's horrified, and her heart turns to stone. And in that transformation of her heart deadening to herself and her actions and her choices, he is able to remove her head. But the removal of the head, especially in the mythological sense, where the head can still has the monstrous characteristics of the monster, or the monstrous person, that isn't a slaying of the being. Because, and this is a thought that I had in what I call my incarceration, and that I haven't known what to do with, but all of the movies that they played, and they played a lot of movies in that place, all of the conflicts were resolved with mortal violence. And if you remember my main and recurring complaint during Sea of Stars, it's that none of the conflicts are mortal. None of them are so dangerous that somebody has to die as a result of somebody's choices. Except for the fat guy, Garl. But he didn't die as a result of anybody's choices but his own, which is kind of a criticism. Again, it's not just kind of. Like, if you read the symbols for what they're saying, it's a criticism of you for having played the game, for having sacrificed your time to it. It was a choice that wasn't really yours to make, is what they're telling you. But we interpret the cutting off of the head as a slaying of the character. But in the righteous kill, in the mortal conflict, when the hero slays the villain is gone forever. Okay? So when the head is cut off, when they show you the villain's head cut off, the villain's head being cut off is a trophy and a signal that the story is over and that everything is right with the world again. In the same way that Han Solo being given that medal at the end of the movie is saying that he's redeemed of having shot first and having killed Greedo in sin, in effect. That this is a character who's achieved redemption because he returned for the good fight when it mattered most. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, he gets a blindside shot on Darth Vader, who didn't know he was in the battle. So in fact, if it weren't for his scoundrel ways, and if it weren't for his willingness to shoot enemies who don't know he's there, the battle wouldn't have been won. In Greek mythology, that remains true. When a character dies, they're dead. When the head is cut off, they're dead, right? When the villain's head is cut off, they're dead. But Medusa isn't a villain. Medusa is an FSR character. And Medusa's archetype is the willful woman who uses turning men to stone to get her political needs. Well, when Adonis or whoever turns her to stone, it's the same thing. He just turns her magic against her. Sure, he cuts her head off, but what does it mean in English, in the English idiom, to lose your head? Right? Isn't that what Alice in Wonderland is about? Isn't that the recurring theme of keep your head, right? Isn't she trying to off with her head, right? To lose your head means to be insane, right? And so to be insane means to make choices that are bad for you, or that don't make sense, right? And so it doesn't make sense for Medusa to join Spartacus's side and fight this Titan, because Medusa gets her power from the same place as that Titan, from the same. You could call it ancient. You could even call it prehistoric. That deep place. She gets her magic from that same deep place. That's why she's the priestly class, the most scary and the most visually striking of the priestly class from the previous generation. She is an FSR, for story reasons character. She exists as an archetype. She is, and I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because it struck me last night as I was trying to figure out what the hell is going on with my brain and how to put it back together. I realized that Italy Catholicism, Roman Catholic Christianity, had a huge task ahead of it to convert and civilize all of Europe. All of Europe as we know it, east of or west of whatever, the Danube or whatever. They had a huge task ahead of them because Rome never did it. And so wanting to do that, wanting to convert them all to at least the Italian Roman Christianity that's a cultural conversion. So what we're talking about when we're talking about this hero cutting off the head of this grandparent generation, let's say, monster, this holdover from the previous generation, okay? And so a holdover from the previous generation would be a Nazi, right? Like a neo-Nazi is a holdover from the previous generation. It's neo-Nazis aren't a holdover from our parents; they're a holdover from our grandparents or even our great-grandparents, right? They're an ancient or an antique holdover, and now time moved a lot more slowly back then. So it wasn't the actual grandparents; it wasn't actually 40 or 80 years previous or whatever. It would have been more like 400 years previous or something like that. Okay. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for her and her archetype to help Jason. It just doesn't. It doesn't make sense for her to help Athens because her goals are in direct opposition to Athens. Whether, in whatever way, because again, she's an FSR, 4 Story Reasons archetype of the people who once reigned over, or even a better word would be terrorized, the people of Athens. So this character, it doesn't make sense for this character to want to help Athens, because everything she does is trying to bury Athens and bring back the superiority of her culture. Because this story, mythology, is culture war. It's culture warfare. These aren't just stories that they tell, right? These are the stories that they tell to combat the stories that are told in other areas. And what makes you a race is sharing the same interpretations of maybe slightly different stories, okay? And I know I wandered off something that I wanted to talk about earlier, but hero worship is important because heroes are the previous generation's gods, typically. Okay, so like American heroes are people like George Washington and Ben Franklin. Well, those people are long dead, but they're people whose stories we keep around because they're relevant to model Americans after. Well, in that same way, Adonis or Jason in the Argonauts or somebody like Odysseus, these people, whether they lived or didn't live, and they lived, for sure they lived, absolutely they lived. Whether they did or they didn't live is irrelevant. They become heroes because they're people for you to model yourself after, for young boys and young girls to pick and choose whom to model themselves after. And so what comparative mythology will do, especially feminists, is they'll look at these stories and they'll wonder to themselves, well, why are all of these women bad guys? Why is Arachne a bad guy? Why is Lamia, Vincent's personal obsession? Why is she a bad guy? Why do these women kill and eat? Why do they kill babies, right? Why do they hurt? Why do they hurt people? And why are the heroes liberating people? Why are there never, women in the same positions as the hero like they are in modern literature? Well, there are 2 reasons for that. The first reason is that Captain Marvel can't sell. So females and the male lead, people get up and they leave the amphitheater. Okay? That's one reason, is because people don't want to, audiences don't actually want to hear those stories. As much as people say that they're tired of it always being the same archetype, always being the same thing, the people that complain about that aren't actually buying tickets. They're getting attention for complaining about something that people didn't know that they had never thought about. Oh, I never noticed that girls aren't in the lead role. Girls should be in the lead role, but the people that agree with that, even if they're watching movies, they're enjoying movies that don't have girls in the lead role, and then when they go and they watch like Scarlett Johansson's leads, they go, "What the fuck was that? That was lame and boring. And why did she act like a man throughout?" So it's difficult to build pathos for a woman who behaves like a man, and the reason that is because people have lived experience, and men, when they have PTSD, they break down into a certain kind of way, and one of the certain kind of things that they do is they grab women by the hair and they kill monsters. Women, when they have PTSD, tend to put snakes in their hair and kill you in your sleep with poison. And so they're the same character. The thing is, when you're trying as a storyteller, and you have to remember that the people who were telling the stories in the PIE tradition are the old men, they're the druids, right? Well, when you're an old man or an old woman, and a lot of these stories, if you actually read the oldest versions, they read with the pathos and the empathy of a grandmother, not the hardness and really lack of empathy of a grandfather. And I don't care if you're a girl and you're saying, but it was my grandma who was hard and lacked empathy, and my grandfather was always soft and encouraging. It's like, right, but what were the stories your grandfather was telling you? He wasn't telling you the stories that were preparing you to be a woman. He was just telling you nice stories. If you listen to the stories your grandmother is telling you, she's telling you about, like, the Three Little Pigs, or she's telling you about Little Red Riding Hood, or she's telling you about the Baba Yaga, right? But if you're a little boy and you're like, well, my grandma wasn't telling me those kind of stories. My grandma was telling me stories about growing big and strong and being a superhero. And it's like, bingo. Little boys and little girls are different. They have different needs, they have different requirements, and they have different things to look out for in adulthood. So Medusa is a hero in that story. She's an FSR character. For sure. She sacrifices her life at the end of the story, right? Him cutting her head off, she's dead as a result of the story, but she is the reason that he was able to accomplish the goal that liberated Athens from the great evil. So the reason she's remembered, and the reason she's remembered for all of her traits, not just her good traits, let's repeat that. She's remembered for all of her traits, everything about her, good and bad. She's remembered for all of those reasons as a lesson to little girls. That, look, your sex, literally your sex, your sex organs can be used for good. And the way that you use them for good is you turn them on the enemy, not on the men immediately of your race. Or because if you think of it from the Spartan point of view, the Mycenaeans, the Gorgons, were a slave people. And so if you have a woman in your midst who's a freed or elevated slave, who's turning the men around her to stone with a simple glance, you have a cancer in your midst. And now if you can find a way to make that cancer contagious and you can put it in your enemy, that's the Black Widow. But if she's among you, she's a Gorgon. And the story is as much a lesson to little girls, a reminder to little girls that, look, should you grow up and should you choose to use your sex and your sexuality spitefully to hurt Athens, Athens will sacrifice you to Athens' enemies. And so sacrifices is another topic. Sacrifice is a huge topic, and I've been going for an hour and a half. So we're not going to go there. But there is a power in that, in knowing that if I'm interpreting this for little girls and I'm telling feminists that they're wrong, that this is an extremely sexual story, this is a warning about your sex and your sexuality, but it is not sexist, because if it were sexist, she wouldn't have been necessary to the story at all. Because think about it. Just think about it for a moment. Her head isn't the MacGuffin that they need. Okay? Because if her head were the MacGuffin, you just sneak up on her and you just take the head off. Or you jump her with a group of men and you sacrifice a couple of them because she can only use her magic death beam so many times. But it's not a magic death beam. You understand? It's a metaphor. She doesn't actually have magic. Okay? So you can't manfully jump her because she's not a 10-foot tall half-snake woman with impossible strength like you see Gorgons portrayed in God of War, for instance. Okay? She's just a woman. And something that women are reminded of constantly in mythology is that in the face of a man willing to do it, they are completely invulnerable to death. Or completely not uninvulnerable to death. And what I mean by that is that a woman at any time, in any place, is vulnerable to being killed for any reason in the pre-modern world. And frankly, we've forgotten, and the way we remind ourselves of it is problematic. We've forgotten that very thing, and the way we remind ourselves of it is women going on TV and social media and hyperbolizing and catastrophizing catcalls in the street. But, you know, one of the things that we've also forgotten is that a marker of civilization in pre-modern civilizations, even in modern civilizations, because we have to remember that we exist in the post-modern period, and that's annoying. But in the modern and the pre-modern periods, cities were judged by their residents by whether women could go outside at night without fear of rape and death. And if the United States, just as an example, has any one city where that's not the case, that a woman cannot go out in the city without fear for her life or her sex, you don't live in a civilization. You don't live in among civilized people. You live in a barbarian collapse. And that's what the Gorgon is a reminder of. The Gorgon is a reminder of a civilization that collapsed for a particular reason. You know, Mycenae didn't collapse under its own weight. But it also lost all of the culture wars after the island, the volcano is called Santorini, I believe. After it blew up, so this island volcano blows up, sinks most of Crete under the water, and scatters an overpopulous island people across the Mediterranean. But what happened is that those people, the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Carthaginians, as they became the, did I say Phoenicians? They didn't call themselves these things. The people that they became, they just blended into the culture of the people that they landed among. They conquered them with weapons, for sure, but they adopted their culture. Basically, what I mean to say is they married their daughters. And so the genetic memory of, not powerlessness, but the genetic memory of women having a say, and having a particular kind of say, and a say in a particular kind of way. And the memory of how that was taken from them exists. And neo-pagans I suddenly have the hiccups, but neo-pagans identify the slaying of these serpents. They identify the slaying of Medusa, or the transformation of Lilith into a Lamia or a Medusa character, or the transformation of the Asherah tree into the deadly serpent, right? The basic or fundamental serpent slaying myth, like St. George. They identify these as a killing of the goddess, and as an establishment of the patriarchy as they seem to understand it. And the patriarchy as they seem to understand it is domination by the male of the home and the state. And domination is not what men do in these patriarchal states that they're describing. And so they keep having to move the bar, or the goalpost, as they say, of when the patriarchal state was really established. And so now they've had to move that date up to the 50s. And so if what we're fighting against as reasonable human interested people is a patriarchal state that has only existed for 70 years, what we're fighting against is a fiction. Because the folklore tells us that if your villains are only a generation old, if they're actually from your grandparents' generation, then they're new villains. They're the most recent version of the archetype. And the reason that the Greeks and the Jews and the Romans and the Christians and the everyone and the Muslims argue, what they're actually arguing about is the antiquity of their idea. They're trying to push the date for when it first appeared back in time. And they're doing it badly, because I'm not sure that everything does, in fact, date back to the axial age, if only because when people mean when they say the axial age is fucky, because the axial age can be 2,500 years ago, it can be 4,000 years ago, it can be 1,500 years ago, it can be the end of the 1177 period, right? The collapse of the Bronze Age. It can be 900 BC. There are a lot of dates for when the axial age happened, and they're all fucky, which means to me that this pushing the date of when these ideas first sprang up in the human evolutionary timeline is a lie or a fabrication, or if nothing else, a misdirection about the ideas. And so if we understand that the Gorgon character is a character written for then a modern contemporary audience, that means that at some point the Gorgon religion went away. This serpent cult went away. But they were aware of people who still practiced it, and we know that the serpent cult didn't go anywhere in the Middle East, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. The serpent cult is going well and strong among Christians in the American South today. I believe in North Carolina. And so if that's true, then it was true back then. So these people would know this character. And now they didn't watch these plays or listen to these poems or listen to these stories, or specifically they didn't tell these stories for the same reason we do. Like, it wasn't, all right, well, the kids have been doing finger paints, and so let's just sit down and do a story time and put them to bed. That's not what the stories were for. That's not how it worked. Now, that may have happened, for sure. You got to organize a child's life and their time. But these stories were understood to have religious significance, so they would be explained, and children would ask questions, and they would explain the questions. And the warning here with Medusa, because there's always a warning, right, with all of these characters, because these characters, these archetypes, like I said, you can only know about 7 people well. And after that, you're relying on your brain's ability to recognize patterns, and you're relying on really just assuming who these people are, because your brain just doesn't have the cognitive capacity to know more than about 7 people. Not without special training and without special attention to compartmentalizing and knowing exactly whether you're actually interpreting this person or you're relying on habit and ritual from their behavior. But because of that, because you only have the cognitive capacity to know about 7 people, that means there's only about 6 personality types. There's only about 6 people that exist in the world. And so when in the ancient world, they didn't have characters whose traits overlapped, right? So you wouldn't have Odysseus and another character who's smart and wily. And so in that way, you could make a real criticism of the Avengers movies as not being mythological and not being useful mythologically as characters that, especially children, but adolescents and even adults like me who need to put their personality back together, are able to model themselves after, because all of the male characters have the same personality. They all have the same character, right? So Bannon is smart, and Iron Man is smart, and Doctor Strange is smart, and Captain America is smart, and do you see what I'm saying? And Spider-Man is smart, and like their primary attribute is being intelligent, right? So their primary attribute is being Odysseus, and so they're different expressions of the Odyssean character, and that's not useful. You can't because they're different expressions of the same character, so they're the same character in different clothing. And so in that way they're all breaking the fourth wall, because they're all the same character being played by different actors all at the same time on stage. And that's an overwhelming, to me, obviously I didn't enjoy the Avengers movies as much as their individual movies, because for me it's like there's nothing to be learned. These characters all have the same arc, they all have the same personality, they all have the same problem. And that's why people reacted so harshly and so negatively to Doctor Strange having an obsessive love in the Mouth of Madness, or whatever it's called, Multiverse of Madness. And so if there's anything left to say about Medusa, it's also a warning against... It's a warning against getting involved in politics in the first place, because it's kind of because she's the only woman involved in politics in the story, it's kind of there's only one kind of woman who gets involved in politics, and she becomes a devouring mother, if nothing else. But it's also a warning that if you get into politics, some man is going to wrap you around his finger and send you off to fight and die for his interests. Because men only react to the PTSD of living in the ancient world, and really of living in the world, in a handful of ways. And the way that this particular hero, the reason that Medusa doesn't show up and she's not killed by multiple heroes in the story, is because she's an archetype that does this one thing. This is what this kind of woman does, right? And so I'm not entirely certain that I've talked about, because what I really wanted to talk about was how feminism offers up a bad faith interpretation of Medusa. And that Medusa is an interesting and a fun and a pathetic as in a character with pathos, a character that we should feel sympathy for, because Medusa is our daughters, Medusa is our sisters, Medusa in a lot of ways is our mothers. And so one of the things that is true about the Greek tradition, and then became true about the Greek expression of the Christian tradition, is that their artists, by the tradition that reached us, were interested in redeeming their villains. Because they were a backward-looking people. And so I've done a lot of thinking and a lot of examining on this, and I don't have a lot of time left. But we are a forward-looking people. And I think we started looking forward right around 1900 as a world. But the antique world was a backward-looking world. They looked to their ancestors for answers. They didn't look to the future. They didn't skip to their grandchildren's generation to see how problems would play out. And now neither do we, for the record. But we do look ahead to a world that's radically different than ours. And what we used to do was look backward to a world that was radically better than ours. Because what will always be true about a civilization is that what will always be true about any point in human history is that you are either living at the apex of your civilization, or you are living in the valley, or the perceived valley between apexes of civilization. So what happened circa 1900 is we decided that we were at the apex, and now we could start building towers. Towers of Babylon all over the world. And there's a criticism of the way we handle the axis mundi in there, but the axis mundi is a term that I would have to define, and I don't have the time, so I shouldn't have even said it. But the Gorgon is not an inevitability, but she is an FSR. She does have FSR, for she has story reasons. She has efficacy in the story. And so, if you understand narrative, if you understand that perception and your brain's function as a narrator is the very observation that I was talking about earlier, that they understood that by observing the people around them and closely observing themselves and the man in the mirror through the man that was reflected back to them in the mirror, but also by closely observing their past and their folklore and the evolution of their folklore, because by the 1st century, by the time the Christians were doing their thing, the pagans were also canonizing and doing scholarship of their history. We've just lost most of it because it was burned up. But the Christianization process of Judaism was also happening among Greeks. In a lot of ways, that's what the Gnostic Christians was they were observing the Greek pagan canon and the Latin Roman pagan canon in the same way that the Jewish Christians were observing the Jewish canon. But the canon is the measuring stick. It's the literature and the folklore by which people's lives are measured, right? So I think when we try to say that what Medusa is and only what Medusa is evidence of men being sexist and marginalizing women, I think it's hurtful to the people that were telling those stories to little girls, because little girls heard those stories about Medusa. And little girls rooted for little Jason, right? Even though whether it's Jason or Odysseus, I can't remember which story it was, but even the one who went off, it's probably the Odysseus, but it was probably the Argonauts. It doesn't matter. The one who went off and had like 3 wives that all had multiple kids, and he abandoned the first 2 wives and the kids, and then the third wife went crazy when she found when she finds out and kills the kids and chases him down trying to kill him. And you can just, in my mind's eye, I can just see it, like she's on a motorboat and it's like a James Bond thing with this crazy woman chasing him with an AK-47, right? It's so vivid and real. And these are not warnings, they're not triumphs for the men. These are warnings to the men. They're ethical stories for little boys. But they're also warnings to the little girls, like, hey, observe the man you marry, because there's a very good chance he's one of these. There's more than a very good chance. It's actually more likely than not he's one of these kind of men. And so that's why, like, Medusa is not a character who exists in the story to die. She's a character who exists in the story as a fundamental element of victory. Because she's the only thing that the foreign threat is weak against. And what that implies is that she is a member of the foreign threat in some subtle way. She's an expression of an ancient people that no longer exists, but you have to remember, they no longer exist because they assimilated to the people that they moved among. So expressions of their culture, like the snake cult, or at least like priestesses who are significantly more powerful in the court of the king or in the democracy, among the nobles of the democracy, that these women exist is obvious, and it's true because we know it about Republican Rome. We know how powerful Cleopatra was, and don't try to act like Cleopatra wasn't a high priest of Isis, and don't try to act like there's no serpent cult to Isis, because the Isis cult by the time of Cleopatra had absorbed all of the Wadjet cult, and the Wadjet cult was the cult of the Asclepian rod, and the Asclepian rod, the rod with the rod or the staff with the single snake climbing it or draped across it, because it's very often portrayed before the Christian tradition as a cross, carried just like Jesus is shown carrying the cross to his sacrifice, because Jesus is meant to be the serpent. Because Jesus, I am fully convinced the more I learned that Jesus, if Jesus lived, he was Mary Magdalene. He was absolutely not the male head of the cult. That's why so much of the literature that's been occulted and destroyed has Jesus surviving, because somebody took his place at the final death. And that only the Marys, only the women are the only ones who actually see him in the flesh after his resurrection, means to me that it was actually one of the women who went to that cross. But that's also a Medusa, is kind of what I'm saying, is the Medusa is kind of the serpent on the pole, and the pole is the axis mundi, and again, we can't get into that. But the serpent on the stick seems to be maybe the very, very oldest symbol. Maybe the very oldest, and certainly the very oldest common symbol, because it seems to come out of the same place that we evolved. It seems to come out of Central and Southern Africa, because it only went away when Islam came into Western and Central Africa, and it hasn't gone anywhere in the places that were never Christianized or Muslimified. Never made to Muslim or to Islam or whatever. Never made to bow. Never made to submit. And what she is foresight. She's foresight and she's divinity. And divinity is the ability to speak with the other side, with the devas from Indian tradition, also a PIE language. And the devas are the angels, and the angels are the expressions of the will of the universe, let's say. So the angels in a more modern expression are the gears by which God made the universe. And so there are an infinite number of angels, and as I've said, in the worldview of the people who were writing about Medusa, the angels, so to speak, the lesser gods or the demigods or the heroes or the spirits, the daemon, these things are observing us at all times and making our thoughts and our feelings and our actions real. Because even if you're alone in a forest, your voice makes a sound. You aren't the only being that hears you speak, so to speak. Medusa is what happens when you don't observe yourself. Narcissus is what happens when you don't observe yourself. And so maybe let's end on a riddle, like a good Buddhist would. Okay? Listening to psychologists and therapists, because I've consented to treatment, so I'm trying to take it seriously and listen to what's out in the milieu. And something that I'm hearing a lot of is an encouragement to look in the mirror and mistake that for the self. Not the true self, but the current self. And to love that, the current self. And so I want to know what the difference in talking to and mistaking yourself for the man in the mirror and narcissistic psychopathy is. Because you are not what you see in the mirror. If what Medusa saw in the mirror made her fall in love, made her sexually aroused, and the sexual arousal of seeing herself the way men see her is what they mean by she was turned to stone, then we've already talked about that, why women are left so frequently to masturbate to themselves in front of their phones. But if it means that she looked herself in the face and her heart was turned to stone because, like her male counterparts, she had been obsessing over her body and her image, and for the first time she looked at herself self-critically she wasn't able to forgive herself for who she was and what she had done, then that would also turn her heart to stone. And so if because she was turned to stone, because she didn't love herself any longer, she was willing to give herself her head, not her body, but her mind, if she was willing to bend or allow her mind to be taken from her by a man, but having done that was necessary to complete the story, she's given redemption by the storyteller. Because what could have happened is that she could have been at the doorway to the great beast that was the final monster. She could in some way be, let's say, Lilith, or, the stereotypical vampire or succubic demon that stands at the doorway to the throne of Satan. But in fact, she is the key to defeating Satan in her story. And so without the self-critical sacrifice of will, really, which comes from seeing that you've worked against the good and then giving your life in the process of attaining the good, is what that movie, Rogue One, is about. So this is an ancient story. And now a feminist would say, oh, well, you're by gender shifting the Gorgon and by gender shifting Medusa male, you prove our point. And to that I ask, what other role does a man have to play in a society dominated by women in all of the lead roles than the free will sacrifice? Because what you want from us is for us to fight in your wars and fuck off. And is that not a free will sacrifice? Are not all of these little boys chopping off their dicks in an effort to be accepted by little girls? Are they not making a free will sacrifice? What Medusa did was allowed him to cut off her free will because she hated herself and what she had done. The warning in there is the same warning that Mary Magdalene gives us. It's just don't make choices that are going to make you hate you. Just don't be a Gorgon. Don't join that cult. Just don't do it. Don't date that boy. Just don't do it. What movies and social media have taught us is that our life is a narrative, and other people are interested more in the narrative than in the pilot. But that's the wrong interpretation. That's not true. If you listen long enough to podcasts and YouTube channels, they become cults of personality. Because what the audience wants is to be a friend of and to be famous by proxy with or to the creator or the talent. And so next time, I probably won't talk about how talent or a creator or a prophet can separate themselves from their personality and the cult that naturally rises up around it. Because Jesus never did. In fact, that's what the Gospels are about. They're about distancing the personality from the message. And whether that was cultural warfare against a cult of Medusas who were just as educated and just as literate as their male counterparts is irrelevant, but an interesting hint for you when you go and you look for this stuff on your own. Thank you for listening. I have been the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. This has been Shaggy Dog Philosophy, the podcast. Thank you for making it this far. That makes you pretty cool. I'll talk to you again soon.